The universe, as it turned out, had a pecking order. Not the kind your high school guidance counselor warned you about, mind you, but the sort that involved plasma cannons, mandibles, the size of small aircraft, and a distressing tendency for entire species to vanish into what the galactic insurance companies politely termed nutritional redistribution events. At the very top of this cosmic food chain sat the Vorthak Empire, a collection of 8-foot-tall bipedal nightmares who had spent the last 3 millennia proving that evolution occasionally got drunk and decided to create something that belonged in a fever dream. Picture a cross between a praying mantis and a medieval knight. Then add 4 extra arms, natural armor plating that could deflect small asteroids, and reflexes that made hummingbirds look sluggish. Oh, and did we mention the charming habit of consuming their defeated opponents? Because apparently, Conquest wasn't quite complete without a light snack afterward. The Vorthak had built their empire on a simple principle: might makes right, and we have all the might, so we make all the rights. It was a philosophy that had served them remarkably well across 17 different star systems and counting. They'd conquered the crystal-singing Harmonians of Beta Centauri, turned the shape-shifting Fluidians into an endangered species, and made the technologically superior Nexari civilization agree to unfavorable trade agreements through the time-honored diplomatic technique of showing up with really big guns. But where the Vorthak truly excelled, where they had elevated brutality into an art form, was in their grand tournament of supremacy. Every solar cycle, representatives from across the galaxy would gather in the massive Colosseum orbiting Vorthak Prime, to watch their champion demonstrate why resistance was not only futile but also likely to result in being eaten. The tournament served multiple purposes: entertainment for the masses, a convenient way to eliminate potential threats, and a recruitment tool for finding new species worthy of joining their empire as, let's call them, enthusiastic volunteers. The current champion, a particularly imposing specimen known as Apex Hunter Ghorth, had held the title for an impressive 47 consecutive victories. Ghorth stood 9 feet tall even when slouching, possessed reflexes that bordered on precognition, and had never met an opponent who lasted longer than 30 seconds in the ring. The betting pools had long since stopped taking wagers on whether he would win. The only remaining question was how quickly his next victim would be reduced to component atoms. Ghorth's fighting style was a thing of terrible beauty. He moved like liquid death, flowing from one killing technique to another, with the casual grace of someone who had never encountered meaningful resistance. His 6 arms could strike from impossible angles, his natural armor had never been penetrated, and his combat experience spanned conflicts across half the known galaxy. He was, by every measurable metric, the perfect killing machine. The Colosseum itself reflected Vorthak's sensibilities, a monument to controlled violence that could seat 3 million spectators around a hexagonal fighting pit, large enough to host aerial combat. Force fields contained the action while allowing perfect visibility, and the arena floor was equipped with environmental controls that could simulate everything from Arctic tundra to molten hellscape. Not that environmental conditions typically mattered much when your champion could adapt to anything the universe threw at him. The latest tournament season had drawn representatives from 43 different species, each hoping that their champion might somehow, against all odds and basic physics, manage to last long enough to land a single blow against Ghorth. The Crystalline Collective had sent their finest warrior priest, who had lasted exactly 12 seconds before being converted into very expensive gravel. The Nebula Dancers had offered their most agile combatant, whose impressive acrobatic display ended when Ghorth plucked him out of mid-flight like a particularly athletic fruit. And now, as the tournament entered its final phase, the galaxy had been treated to the announcement that the newest members of Galactic Society, a species that had only recently discovered faster-than-light travel and still used projectile weapons like savages, would be sending a representative. These humans, as they called themselves, had managed to impress exactly no one with their diminutive stature, laughably fragile biology and complete lack of natural weaponry. The betting pools had responded to this news with something approaching hysteria. The odds against the human representative had reached levels that required scientific notation to express properly. Bookmakers across 17 star systems were accepting bets with the kind of confidence typically reserved for physical constants and the eventual heat death of the universe. Even the Vorthak High Command had struggled to contain their amusement. A species that couldn't survive in their own planet's natural environment without artificial assistance, sending a warrior to face Ghorth, it was almost insulting in its futility. The human delegation had been granted a spot in the tournament, mostly as a form of elaborate entertainment, a brief diversion before the real competition continued. The preliminary biological scans had only reinforced these assumptions. The human representative massed less than half of Ghorth's weight, possessed no natural armor, no extra limbs, no enhanced reflexes and no obvious adaptations for combat. Their bone density was laughably low, their muscle structure seemed optimized for endurance rather than power, and their reaction times fell well within the baseline range for standard prey species. What made the situation even more amusing was the humans' apparent confidence. While every other challenger had approached the tournament with the appropriate mix of desperation and resignation, the human delegation seemed almost relaxed. Their representative had spent the pre-tournament period engaging in what appeared to be casual conversation with other competitors, as if they were attending some sort of social gathering rather than preparing for almost certain death. The Vorthak found this attitude simultaneously baffling and entertaining. Here was a species so thoroughly outclassed that they apparently couldn't even comprehend the magnitude of their disadvantage. It was like watching a small rodent challenge a fusion reactor to single combat, amusing in its complete disconnect from reality. As the final preliminary matches concluded and the tournament brackets were finalized, the anticipation throughout the Colosseum reached fever pitch. Ghorth's next opponent had been determined, and the entire galaxy was preparing to witness what would almost certainly be the shortest championship bout in tournament history. The human representative was about to face the undisputed apex predator of known space, and absolutely everyone knew exactly how this was going to end. The human delegation's arrival at the tournament facilities had been, to put it charitably, underwhelming. While other species typically announced their presence with elaborate ceremonies, intimidating war cries, or at minimum some form of posturing designed to unnerve potential opponents, the humans had simply walked off their transport ship and asked directions to the nearest cafeteria. Not the Warriors' Feast Hall, mind you, the regular cafeteria where they proceeded to express genuine enthusiasm about something called space coffee. Their representative, a compact individual who appeared to be in their mid-30s by human standards, stood barely 6 feet tall and possessed the kind of unremarkable appearance that made security guards everywhere instinctively relax. No visible cybernetic enhancements, no ritual scarification, no intimidating facial tattoos, just a human in what appeared to be a standard-issue military uniform that looked like it had been designed by a committee of accountants with a deep fear of standing out. The alien spectators had initially assumed this was some sort of elaborate joke. Surely the actual champion was still in transit, or perhaps undergoing final preparations in secret. But as the pre-tournament briefings commenced and the human continued to respond to questions with the kind of casual professionalism typically associated with middle management, it became clear that this really was their fight. The medical examinations had been particularly enlightening, if by enlightening you meant deeply concerning for anyone who had wagered money on the human lasting more than 5 seconds. The Vorthak medical technicians, accustomed to cataloging the impressive physical specifications of various galactic warriors, found themselves staring at readouts that suggested they were examining a particularly athletic office worker, rather than a champion fight. Bone density, adequate for a species that had evolved in standard gravity, but hardly impressive by galactic combat standards. Muscle mass, optimized for efficiency rather than raw power. Reflexes, good enough to avoid walking into walls but nothing that would trouble a professional athlete, let alone a combat-trained Vorthak. The medical team had actually rechecked their instruments twice, convinced that such pedestrian physical capabilities couldn't possibly belong to someone entering the tournament voluntarily. What made the situation even more surreal was the humans' response to these examinations. While other competitors typically used medical evaluations as opportunities to demonstrate their physical superiority, flexing impressive musculature, showing off enhanced reflexes, or displaying various combat-related modifications, the human had spent the entire process asking technical questions about Vorthak physiology with the kind of academic curiosity typically exhibited by biology students on a field trip. The betting pools across the galaxy had responded to this information with the kind of mathematical precision that occurs when an entire civilization simultaneously reaches the same obvious conclusion. The odds against the human had moved beyond merely astronomical and entered territory that required new forms of mathematical notation. Several betting establishments had actually stopped accepting wagers, not out of any sense of fairness, but because calculating potential payouts was threatening to crash their quantum computing systems. The pre-fight interviews had done nothing to improve the humans' prospects. While Ghorth had delivered his traditional pre-combat statement, a bone-chilling recitation of his victims' names,
followed by a detailed description of how he planned to consume his next opponent. The human had responded to media questions with the kind of measured professionalism that suggested they were discussing quarterly earnings rather than imminent mortal combat. When asked about their strategy for facing the galaxy's most feared warrior, the human had actually smiled and mentioned something about adapting battlefield doctrine to local conditions. The assembled journalists had initially assumed this was either elaborate psychological warfare or possibly a translation error, but follow-up questions had revealed a concerning pattern of responses that suggested the human genuinely believed they had a reasonable chance of success. The other tournament competitors had watched these proceedings with a mixture of horror and fascination. The Nexari representative, whose own species had developed combat technology that could level city blocks, had privately admitted to colleagues that they couldn't determine whether the humans possessed some form of advanced camouflage technology or were simply suffering from a species-wide inability to process risk assessment properly. Even more disturbing was the humans' apparent lack of any visible weapons or combat enhancements. Tournament regulations permitted a wide range of personal equipment, from energy shields to cybernetic augmentation, but the human had declined all optional gear and registered for combat with nothing more than their standard uniform and what appeared to be a standard-issue military sidearm that fired primitive chemical projectiles. The weapons inspectors had initially refused to approve such an obviously inadequate armament, assuming it was some form of administrative error. The psychological evaluation had been perhaps the most baffling aspect of the entire pre-tournament process. Standard combat psychology profiles looked for specific markers: controlled aggression, threat assessment capabilities, tactical thinking under pressure, and the human had scored well within normal parameters for a trained soldier. Not exceptional, mind you, just competent. It was like discovering that someone had entered a fusion-powered racing circuit with a bicycle and seemed genuinely confident about their chances of winning. As the final day of preparation dawned, the Colosseum's atmosphere had shifted from anticipation to something approaching dark comedy. Spectators were arriving not to witness a contest between warriors, but to observe what was widely expected to be the most spectacular mismatch in tournament history. Vendors were selling commemorative items with timestamps, betting that the fight wouldn't last long enough for traditional merchandising to be relevant. Ghorth himself had initially expressed annoyance at being matched against such obviously inadequate opposition. The champion prided himself on facing worthy adversaries, and the prospect of adding a human to his victory tally felt almost insulting. However, as tournament officials explained that the match would serve as a demonstration of Vorthak's superiority to the galaxy's newest member, he had grudgingly accepted the assignment with the kind of professional resignation typically associated with having to explain basic concepts to particularly slow students. The champion's preparation routine remained unchanged despite the obvious mismatch. Ghorth spent his final hours reviewing combat recordings, practicing technique combinations, and consuming the traditional pre-fight meal of a defeated opponent's favorite foods, a psychological ritual that had never failed to unnerve previous challengers. The human, by contrast, had reportedly spent their preparation time reviewing technical manuals and performing what observers could only describe as light calisthenics. As the moment of truth approached, and both fighters were called to their respective preparation areas, the energy in the Colosseum had reached unprecedented levels. 3 million spectators representing dozens of species had gathered to witness what everyone assumed would be the most predictable outcome in combat sports history. The human walked toward the arena entrance, with the kind of calm focus that suggested they were heading to a routine training exercise, rather than certain death. Behind them, an entire galaxy held its collective breath, waiting to see how quickly the universe's newest members would learn their place in the cosmic pecking order.
The arena announcer's voice boomed across the Colosseum, with the kind of theatrical enthusiasm that suggested he'd been practicing this moment for weeks. In 17 different languages, he proclaimed the beginning of what would surely be remembered as either the shortest or most educational bout in tournament history. The crowd's roar reached levels that threatened to compromise the structural integrity of nearby space stations. Ghorth entered first, as was traditional for the defending champion. The Vorthak warrior moved with liquid grace, his 6 arms flowing through a ritual combat sequence that had been perfected over centuries of warfare. Each movement demonstrated perfect balance, devastating power, and the kind of casual lethality that made seasoned warriors reconsider their career choices. The arena's sensors registered energy signatures that indicated he was operating at approximately 60% of his maximum combat capacity, more than sufficient to handle whatever pathetic resistance the human might offer. The human entered from the opposite gate and immediately committed what every combat expert in the galaxy recognized as a fundamental tactical error. They walked directly to the center of the arena and no defensive positioning, no attempt to use environmental features for cover, no indication that they understood basic principles of battlefield geometry. They simply stood there, hands at their sides, looking for all the world like someone waiting for a public transport shuttle. The betting pools registered a final surge of activity as spectators rushed to place last-minute wagers on exactly how the fight would end. Vaporization was the early favorite, followed by creative dismemberment and the traditional Vorthak finishing move known as structural reorganization. A few optimistic souls had wagered on the human lasting a full 10 seconds, which most analysts considered laughably generous. The tournament referee, a heavily armored individual whose job security depended on maintaining appropriate distance from Vorthak champions, activated the arena's combat protocols and announced the commencement of hostilities. The chronometers began counting, and 3 million spectators leaned forward in anticipation of witnessing galactic history. For the first 2 seconds, everything proceeded exactly as expected. Ghorth launched himself across the arena with the kind of explosive speed that had made him legendary throughout known space. His trajectory was perfect, his killing strike precisely calculated, and his 6 arms positioned to deliver a combination attack that would end the fight before the human's nervous system could process what was happening. Physics, biology, and 3 millennia of Vorthak combat doctrine all agreed on the inevitable outcome. Then the human moved. It wasn't the kind of movement that combat experts recognized. No traditional martial arts forms, no established defensive patterns, no techniques that appeared in any galactic combat manual. Instead, the humans seemed to simply relocate themselves to a different position in space through what could only be described as aggressive lateral thinking. Where Ghorth's killing strike should have connected with soft human tissue, it encountered only empty air and a growing sense of confusion. But that was merely the opening act of what would later be analyzed by military strategists as the most efficient demonstration of applied violence in recorded galactic history. The humans' response to Ghorth's attack was to produce their primitive chemical projectile weapon with a speed that bordered on the supernatural. Not supernatural in the sense of violating physical laws, mind you, but supernatural in the sense that it suggested someone had spent considerable time practicing the specific art of making small metal objects appear in their hand very quickly. What followed could generously be described as a barrage, though that term typically implies a duration measured in minutes rather than heartbeats. In the space of 3 seconds, 3 seconds that would be replayed, analyzed, and studied by military academies for generations, the human fired 17 rounds with the kind of precision that suggested they had been personally tutored by the fundamental forces of physics. Each projectile found its target with mathematical certainty, not Ghorth's heavily armored torso or his reinforced combat chassis, but the tiny gaps in his natural armor where joints connected, where nerve clusters concentrated, where evolutionary biology had made small but critical compromises between protection and mobility. The human had somehow identified and catalogued every vulnerable point on Vorthak anatomy during their casual pre-fight questioning, then proceeded to address each weakness with the methodical efficiency of someone following an instruction manual. The first 3 rounds disabled Ghorth's primary weapon arms. The next 4 compromised his balance and coordination systems. Rounds 5 through 9 addressed his sensory apparatus and cognitive processing center. The remaining shots were delivered with what could only be described as artistic flair, targeting specific nerve clusters that induced temporary paralysis in precise sequence. By the 7th second of combat, the galaxy's most feared warrior was lying motionless on the arena floor, conscious but completely unable to move, while a small human stood over him reloading their weapon with the kind of casual proficiency that suggested this was just another day at the office. The silence in the Colosseum was so complete that spectators in the upper sections could hear the mechanical clicking of the human's reloading procedure. 3 million beings representing the accumulated wisdom and experience of dozens of advanced civilizations sat in stunned contemplation of what they had just witnessed. The chronometers continued their relentless count, 8 seconds, 9 seconds, 10 seconds. At the 10-second mark, the human completed their reload, secured their weapon, and looked up at the tournament referee with the kind of expectant expression that suggested they were waiting for someone to explain what happened. The referee, whose extensive experience with Vorthak combat had not prepared him for this particular scenario,
consulted his rulebook with the desperate intensity of someone whose continued existence might depend on finding the correct procedural guide. After several moments of frantic page-turning, he activated his communications system and made the announcement that would echo across 17 star systems. Victory. Human representative. Time elapsed 10 seconds. The crowd's response progressed through several distinct phases. First came the silence of cognitive processing, as millions of brains attempted to reconcile what they had observed with everything they thought they knew about combat, physics, and the natural order of the universe. This was followed by a low murmur of confused discussion, as spectators turned to their neighbors seeking confirmation that they had all experienced the same impossible event. Finally, as the implications began to sink in, came the sound that would haunt the nightmares of Vorthak leadership for years to come. The roar of 3 million beings suddenly realizing that their fundamental assumptions about galactic power dynamics might require some revision. The human, meanwhile, had walked over to check on their defeated opponent with what appeared to be genuine concern for Ghorth's well-being. They conducted a brief medical assessment, confirmed that the paralysis was temporary, and actually apologized for any inconvenience caused by the necessary tactical responses. The conversation was conducted in perfect Vorthak, which raised additional questions about exactly how much preparation had gone into this apparently casual performance. As medical teams rushed to attend to their former champion and arena officials struggled to process what had just occurred, the human representatives straightened their uniform, checked their equipment, and looked around the stunned Colosseum with the kind of satisfied expression typically associated with completing routine paperwork ahead of schedule. The aftermath of the 10-second revolution began with what historians would later classify as the Great Galactic Pause, a period of approximately 47 minutes during which the normal flow of interstellar communication, trade, and general cosmic business ground to a complete halt as entire civilizations collectively attempted to process what they had just witnessed. The immediate response from Vorthak High Command was predictably bureaucratic. Emergency sessions were convened, committees were formed to analyze the committees that had been formed to study the situation, and a formal inquiry was launched to determine whether the arena's chronometers had malfunctioned. When multiple independent verification systems confirmed that the fight had indeed lasted exactly 10 seconds, and that their champion had been defeated by what amounted to a moderately athletic human with a primitive weapon, the Vorthak leadership entered what their official records would diplomatically describe as a strategic reassessment period. The human, meanwhile, had responded to their historic victory with the kind of understated professionalism that made the entire galaxy question whether they had somehow missed the significance of what had just occurred. When approached by tournament officials requesting a statement for the historical record, they had simply noted that the engagement had proceeded according to standard tactical doctrine, and thanked the medical staff for their prompt attention to the defeated opponent's well-being. This response had prompted the tournament's head analyst, a Nexari strategist whose species had spent centuries studying combat theory, to ask the obvious question: if this was standard doctrine, what exactly constituted advanced tactics in human military thinking? The human had considered this inquiry with the kind of thoughtful expression typically associated with professors explaining basic concepts to particularly slow students, then politely declined to elaborate on grounds of operational security. The betting establishments across 17 star systems faced what could charitably be described as an unprecedented financial crisis. The mathematical improbability of the human victory had resulted in payout calculations that threatened to destabilize several planetary economies. Emergency economic councils were convened, currency markets fluctuated wildly, and at least 3 major banking institutions required emergency bailouts from their respective governments. The human delegation, upon learning of these difficulties, had offered to donate their winnings to galactic charitable organizations, which somehow made the entire situation even more unsettling. Within hours of the fight's conclusion, diplomatic communications networks throughout known space began buzzing with urgent requests for information about human military capability. Trade agreements that had seemed perfectly reasonable when humans were assumed to be harmless newcomers suddenly required comprehensive renegotiation. Defense treaties were hastily amended, border patrol schedules were revised. The overnight transformation of humans from amusing curiosities to potential strategic threats represented the fastest shift in galactic geopolitics since the Crystalline Collective had discovered how to weaponize their singing voices. The scientific community's response was equally dramatic. Xenobiologists who had dismissed human physiology as unremarkable found themselves scrambling to identify what they had obviously missed during their initial assessment. Research grants were rapidly approved for comprehensive studies of human combat psychology, tactical thinking, and the apparently devastating effectiveness of their approach to violence. The preliminary findings were not reassuring. Humans appeared to possess an almost supernatural ability to identify weaknesses in their opponents, while simultaneously concealing their own capabilities, until the precise moment when such concealment was no longer strategically necessary. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the discovery that the human representatives' performance had been, by their own species' standards, entirely routine. Follow-up diplomatic communications revealed that they were not some exceptional warrior or enhanced champion, but rather a standard military personnel selected for the tournament primarily because they had been available when the assignment came up. When asked to elaborate on what humanity's actual elite fighters might be capable of, the diplomatic response had been a polite suggestion that such information would be more appropriately discussed through formal military liaison channels. The Vorthak Empire, faced with the uncomfortable realization that their 3-millennium reign as galactic apex predators might require some revision, had initially attempted to maintain dignity through what their cultural analysts recognized as aggressive denial. Official statements emphasized that the tournament result represented a statistical anomaly, rather than any fundamental challenge to Vorthak supremacy. These statements became increasingly difficult to maintain as additional information about human military history became available through galactic information networks. It turned out that humans had spent their entire evolutionary development engaged in what could only be described as continuous, comprehensive warfare with everything in their environment, including each other, their planet's indigenous fauna, various microscopic organisms, and occasionally their own atmospheric conditions. Their approach to conflict resolution appeared to involve a combination of tactical flexibility, technological innovation, and a disturbing willingness to continue fighting long past the point where any rational species would have negotiated a peaceful settlement. The revelation that humans had actually developed military doctrines specifically for defeating opponents who possessed superior physical capabilities, advanced technology, or significant numerical advantages, prompted several species to quietly begin revising their own defense strategy. The fact that they had done so while simultaneously maintaining diplomatic relations with dozens of potentially hostile neighbors suggested a level of strategic thinking that made even the Nexari leadership nervous. As news of the tournament spread throughout the galaxy, the broader implications began to crystallize. The cosmic pecking order that had remained stable for millennia was suddenly open to revision. Species that had accepted subordinate positions in the galactic hierarchy began reconsidering their options. Trade routes that had been dominated by Vorthak interests started attracting alternative proposals. The entire framework of interstellar relations shifted as everyone attempted to determine where humanity fit into the new order of things. The human delegation, apparently oblivious to the diplomatic earthquake they had triggered, continued to approach these developments with the same matter-of-fact professionalism they had displayed throughout the tournament. When offered expanded trade agreements, strategic partnerships, and defensive alliances by virtually every major power in known space, they had requested time to review the proposals with appropriate governmental authorities. When asked about their long-term intentions regarding galactic politics, they had mentioned something about peaceful coexistence and mutually beneficial cooperation, which somehow sounded significantly more ominous when spoken by a species that had just demonstrated their ability to dismantle apex predators with casual efficiency. The universe, as it turned out, still had a pecking order. The only difference was that everyone was suddenly very interested in determining exactly where humans intended to position themselves within that hierarchy, and whether the galaxy's existing power structures would survive the process of finding out. In the end, the most profound realization was perhaps the simplest. In a cosmos full of species that had evolved to be bigger, stronger, faster, or more technologically advanced, humans had apparently evolved to be more pragmatic. And as 3 million spectators had just learned, pragmatism applied with sufficient precision and delivered at the right moment could be the most devastating weapon of all.